society. So there was a study from the Pew and Research Center that found that religious people are happier than non-religious people.
Right.
And in the U.S., 36% of actively religious people considered themselves as very happy, whereas non-religious people are considered themselves as happy, made up only 25% of that number. So do you think religious people are happier, and if so, why?
Well, I think they are. The why part of this is a little more complicated, and I've seen a variety of different surveys on this. We'll start with the low-hanging fruit, which is people who identify as religious are usually active in a religious community. And we know that continual community engagement, having friends who you regularly meet and see, whether it's in a Sunday school class or whether it's at synagogue or whether it's at the mosque, a Buddhist meditation group, those kinds of community social activities lead to greater happiness, regardless of anything else.
Right.
Something more interesting I've seen is that, and this didn't have to do with religion particularly, but it had to do with fandom. People who are fans of TV series, of movie series, of Star Trekkies, Swifties, okay, are usually happier. And it appears that the reason is that they have something to focus their day around and their life around and their interactions around. They're moving forward with something because it leads them to the anticipation. I will be with people I like, with whom I have something in common. I think it's fairly clear that for most religious people, this is the case.
Right.
They have varying degrees of discipline about their religion and community engagement, but at the very least they know, I'm going to get up and there's a place I can go and there will be people I know. Right. There's a community I relate to.
Right. Yeah, and in that same regards, like the Swifties, like you mentioned, or that religion doesn't necessarily have to be there per se, but if there's a social group that you're in line with, that's a big part of your life, whether you're, big into, anime and cosplay like that group can be, or, video games or whatever it is, some sort of community in which you feel like you're a part of.
Sure.
Now, on that side, though, we can go into deeper meaning into that because you also have the idea of faith, right? The idea of something bigger than yourself. There was, I don't know if you're familiar with Arthur Brooks, but he's a Harvard professor who's dealing along with in the lines of faith, quite religious, but he said that when people focus less on themselves and more on something greater than them, that tends to lead to happiness. So do you think that's the case as well for religion? And are there other ways in which you can achieve that same greater than yourself purpose without religion? Guys, if you're liking the content, please chuck a like on the video, and also don't forget to subscribe. That really helps me with the algorithm to get this video viewed by more of you guys. All right, back to the video. Yeah.
I think it's absolutely the case with religion. And of course, all the religions that I've mentioned, all the religions we know of, have some sense that humans are placed in relation to a transcendent purpose and meaning in life. And because of that, then we are less focused on ourselves. We're focused on fulfilling that purpose that's used Christian or Jewish or Muslim terms that God has for us, right?
Right.
We know where we have a beginning. We know that we've got some kind of end that we're aiming toward, and then that allows us to develop a sense of purpose and meaning in life that drives us forward. And I think it's really well known, and it's as true of humans as it is of dogs, that when we're moving forward mentally and spiritually and emotionally, we're happier.
Right.
Okay, than when we're wallowing in our own stuff.
Right.
So yeah, all religions do that and teach that. One way that, I think David Tracy is the Catholic theologian from the 80s who pointed this out, is we have a horizon toward which we point our lives. Okay.
Right.
Now, those horizons are different in different religions. The Judeo-Christian Islamic religion, the horizon is usually beyond death. But it doesn't really matter how you construct the horizon. Well, it matters from the sense of what's true or not, but in terms of happiness, having that horizon and knowing I'm trying to go to the horizon and beyond, I think that makes us definitely happier people, and religion provides that critical aspect of it. I'll add one other thing to that. You mentioned faith, okay, and the Christian definition of faith, as we find in the book of Hebrews, is hope in things unseen. That's exactly that horizon.
Right.
Right? Hope in things unseen that keeps us moving forward and keeps us from getting absorbed back into ourselves. Right? An interesting aspect of this I'm seeing just in my reading in the last, more than 20 years now. I read pretty widely in popular, let's call popular cosmology. I was an astronomy major at the University of Texas.
Very cool.
I switched to history when I realized I couldn't do the math. About my junior year. I'm one of the few history majors that has a full minor in physics. But what I realized following then cosmology and astronomy over many, many years since then is we reached a kind of a turning point in the 90s where scientists like Carl Sagan, I'm going to mention Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate from the University of Texas where I went to school. These writers who are definitely not religious, don't identify as spiritual, okay? And yet they become constantly aware that humans orient themselves towards something beyond, right?
Right.
Weinberg's maybe the example of this would be his popular book on M theory, it's a cosmological theory, called Dreams of a Final Theory. And so cosmologists, physicists are working on a final theory. What's the place where you get all the math together and you explain the way things are?
Right.
Okay. And Weinberg's book basically gets to the point of saying, we're not going to have a final theory. The thing we know now, complex reasons, we could go into that, is we cannot ever have a fully developed final theory. Because one, the math's too hard, and two, because the laws of nature appear to change prior to the Big Bang and maybe out at the edges. Now, that idea that we can't conceptualize a final theory, which actually goes back to Kurt Gödel and his incompleteness theorem, but then leads Weinberg to ask, what's the meaning of life?
Right.
If the meaning of my life as a cosmologist
right.
has been to get to that final theory, and now you tell me I can't get there, right? What's the meaning of life? And what he interestingly asserts is that trying to go towards the final theory, even if you know you can't reach it, okay, gives life meaning. The exact words he uses are a little bit chilling. He said, it raises life from farce to tragedy. Okay. But even so, you can see he's wrestling with this.
Right.
How do I keep myself oriented?
Sure.
And this, Marcelo Geisner, his book, The Island of Knowledge, Adam Frank, all of them in this last 30 to 34 years, are wrestling with the reality that science is not going to give us a complete picture, that there's going to be a beyond science.
Right.
And that somehow life's meaning is going to be out and beyond that horizon, or at least in orienting toward the horizon.
Which kind of works well with my next question in the case of not just these scientists, but atheists who would say, quote, denounce that God, whatever your definition of God is, and I think we'll talk about that. But how do those people who aren't necessarily scientists, so the scientists find their faith in knowing that there is something there, or the pursuit of that thing is their quote unquote faith, I guess, their purpose, right? And that's how they find purpose. But for the non-scientist, your everyday atheist who doesn't believe in that, how would they go about finding their purpose and faith? And do you feel like it is possible to still find purpose and faith as an atheist?
I think it's a really good question. And I have to say that my interactions with sort of hardcore atheists have not shown a positive aspect of that. That is to say, the people who I've met and interacted with on my blog, for example, who are atheists, tend to be atheists because of a rejection of everything religious. They've had very bad religious experiences. who or whatever God is. They don't associate that word with anything positive, right? They become what Charles Taylor calls heroic atheists. In other words, I just embrace life's meaninglessness, right? But even that's a kind of a purpose, right? I've now become heroic because I'm the one guy in the room that faces the reality. Right. I now have my purpose in life if I'm Sam Harris, and that's to debunk everybody else.
It's still bleak, though.
Or Christopher Hitchens.
Still bleak, I would say.
Well, it seems bleak to me, and it would seem especially bleak when you begin to approach the fact that you can't do it, or you haven't convinced everybody, or simply that what have you got left when you've debunked everything? Right. What are you holding in your hand? Is not much. Right. And so I'm not sure what keeps that kind of atheism going. But, people get emotionally attached to the commitments they've made. Sure. And that's a kind of a substitute for a meaning for life. Right. That makes sense. Yeah. At least I'm the guy that stood up for what I believed right till the end. Right. Yeah. That makes sense. So would you say that speaking of the atheist versus the religious thinking, there's a writer called Yuval Harari. He wrote a book called *Sapiens*. Sure. Yeah. So, a very famous book that I read it a few years ago. But, he argues that the main purpose of religion is to kind of group people into these larger population groups as opposed to these tribal groups of the past. Mm-hmm. And that allowed us to flourish into our large civilizations that we have today. So do you agree with this view of what he feels religion is about, and it's just a means to bring societies together as opposed to find purpose? And maybe both. Yeah. Well, this is a really interesting question because Yuval Harari is a writer I respect a great deal, and he comes from a very unique perspective. He's at the Hebrew National University in Jerusalem, I guess. There's an inside and an outside view of this. So ever since the concept of an axial age in Karl Jasper's writers 100 years ago, an outside view, let's say the sociology of religious view, is let's scientifically look at the function religion has in society and try to understand how it has functioned in society. And this is typically a religious studies viewpoint. We have a whole department of that at SMU, of which I'm not a part. Well, very tangentially. That viewpoint from the outside can, I think, rightly discover that religion has fulfilled these functions. Okay, that is, in particular, the universalizing religions became a means by which nascent empires could unite diverse ethnic groups. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. And so that religion fulfills that function, I don't think there's any question in society. You've got to ask the question, did the emperors set out to do that? Right. So what was their intention? Right. Were they sociologists of religion sitting down and making a political calculation that I will create this kind of religion? Or did this develop more organically in the evolution of society? It's a great question. Right? And because what we don't have the evidence is that any empire in the making actually sat down and said, it's now time for a new age of religion, which I will assert a universal religion, and therefore unite my empire. Right. There's just that it happened. That's one thing. That was intention is another. And of course, the other thing is from within these religious groups that developed. So notably, Buddhism, Proto-Hinduism, what we would call the Brahminic religion, Brahminic synthesis in the subcontinent, Islam and Christianity, Judaism, notably universalistic, but in a very different fashion. We can leave Judaism out for a minute. Okay. But these religions absolutely grew along with empires. Mm-hmm. And yet, from within the religion, each of these religions, there was not a sense that we are here to unite tribal groups. There was a sense that we are here to tell people the truth that we have either realized or has been revealed. Mm-hmm. So you can look from the outside and say religion functioned in this way in society, but the mistake, and I think Harari makes this mistake, is attributing that as a motive in religion. Mm-hmm. That religion was just a means to do this.
Right.
Because the believers, the followers of that religion, never saw it that way. They would have said, we'll just take the Christian example, they would have said, what unites all these tribes is the single truth.
Right, divine truth, right.
It's divine truth.
Right.
Right? And this is, by the way, this I think brings in Judaism a little bit, because in my understanding, and I think I'm right, Judaism always understood that the Jews were to be witnesses to the truth of one God, right, as opposed to idolatry, mm-hmm. even though it was not necessary to absorb all the other ethnic groups into the Jewish community.
Right.
Right. There were to be a distinct community doing that. So that's quite different than Christianity or Islam that ultimately wanted to bring everybody in.
Yeah.
But the same idea, though.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. Do you think, so in that case, that his argument that, the main role of religion is maintaining social order versus like addressing the spiritual, that religion is a divine truth, is kind of up there in the air?
I think it's a bit up there in the air, because it's always dangerous to me to attribute a purpose to any group, any body, any intellectual body, to attribute a purpose to that body which the body itself is not aware of or doesn't consciously have in mind.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense, yeah.
Okay. So, it would be a little bit like saying that with the rise of modern science, and I'm writing a book now, Authentic Humanity in an Artificial Intelligence Age. So I'm trying to trace out some of this history of where we get to where we are,
sure,
which is what I do in my courses. We can absolutely show that the rise of a certain mindset that we associate with science and modernity, has created what Charles Taylor calls a secular age. Mm-hmm. It has created a different way of thinking about ourselves that tends to push away transcendence,
right,
and lock us into immanence. We can say all that's happened.
Sorry, what do you mean when you say immanence? What do you mean by that?
Well, Taylor uses the term immanent frame. That's IMMANENT.
Okay.
Immanent frame. What he means is we can't see beyond the boundaries of the real world.
Okay.
We don't see transcendence at all anymore. We just have to work within what we've got.
Would that be the same kind of idea as saying without faith? Is that the same?
Right, or a very different kind of faith.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
A faith that's entirely locked into faith in myself,
I see.
Faith in my community, faith in my country.
I see.
We can see that science played a role in creating this new mind, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But with very rare exceptions, scientists didn't set out to do this. They set out to tell the truth as they saw it and as they found it in nature,
sure,
and to work out a methodology to do that. Eventually, they would decide that their methodology worked best if you excluded religious revelation, mm-hmm. right? But they weren't out to destroy religion. Mm-hmm. So the fact that science had this effect doesn't mean that it was the intention of the scientists.
Right.
And I think this is the same thing with religion. The fact that religion had the effect of uniting these groups doesn't mean that was the purpose of religion.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Where do you think this secularism, this rise in secularism, will lead us towards in the future?
That's an interesting question. I think there's two sides of it. Let's take the one that Charles Taylor explores, where he says that eventually in the secular age, two things happen. And I'm summarizing an 800-page book. One is that by undermining the traditional religions, mm-hmm. yet without killing the human instinct to look towards the transcendence, that we experience what he calls a supernova of religious options. As people quit being religious and become spiritual and not religious, then a million new religious possibilities emerge.
Right.
As they try to sort themselves out.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So we have a lot less religion, we have a lot more spirituality, and ultimately we have a lot more religions.
Right. Right.
That's one. The other, what he asserts, and this is obviously an assertion, is it, no, is it the case or not? He asserts that we are living in what he calls a cross-pressured age. And the cross-pressuring is that we're between the human instinctive desire to orient ourselves to some transcendent, right?
Right.
And the reality of a culture that wants to lock us into immanence. And so he talks about us as cross-pressured. We're between this sort of internal pressure and this external cultural pressure. And I think we're seeing this. And we're finding in our culture that we're trying to negotiate this as individuals,
right,
as religious bodies, as clubs and societies.
What would you say is what would your definition of God be? Because you ask anybody of a different faith, they'll tell you what God is to them. But what do you think is the essence of God in that sense?
Well, such a good question. I'm going to start by saying that all the different religions have slightly different definitions of God. And some religions, traditional Chinese religion, Buddhism, and Hinduism, have what would be called in a Western sense atheistic definitions of God. That is to say, God for them is not a person.
Right.
Okay. So if we want the most general understanding of God, I think it is within each culture that which is beyond the horizon of human experience. Okay. And I emphasize this culture and language thing because one part of my career was translating the Bible from its original languages into the Malay language. I say I didn't do it. Obviously, I was part of a team. I had my role. But it's very tricky, this word for God. Right. And I studied this problem in many different languages. How do we translate the word God, which is a Germanic root word, Gotter, okay? Because at least in Christianity and in Judaism, to a certain extent, you have previous words, and you have Elohim, right. That's the Hebrew. This becomes in Greek theos, in Latin deus, in the Germanic languages Gott, then English God. Okay, Islam makes a similar thing. It begins with older words, Semitic related words, ilahi, very similar to Elohim, right? Allah, which is actually related Semitically too. You can tell by the sounds.
Adonai in Hebrew.
Adonai, yeah. So, and as those religions moved through these other European languages, they use the word God as well. A little bit different in Asia. And so the God that we in the West always conceived of, God with a capital G, was personal to the extent that we conceive of this God as a person, but a transcendent person,
right?
Person beyond our horizon. Right. And the horizon was typically prior to the beginning of everything and after death.
Right.
Okay. God in the Asian traditions was transcendent but not personal.
Right.
Right. So Tien in the Chinese religious tradition, Brahma in the Hindu tradition, not personal. So if we want a general definition, that which is beyond the horizon, right? That which, I think I would add another thing though in almost all these religions, which is a sense that God, whether personal or impersonal, is benevolent and just. That beyond the horizon of human experience, wherever you go, what you find is something more perfect, more ideal, more equitable, and better for us. Yeah,
I'm going to want to talk. I want to touch back on the personification of God
Yeah.
in those religions versus the Eastern
Sure.
religions. Excuse me. I'm a big fan of Stoicism.
Yeah.
And in the Stoic philosophy, again, probably more in line with the Eastern Asian, the Eastern religions, is that it believes in that God is logos, which is just the divine truth of nature, and that nature has these laws that have been defined, and you have and accepting those, that we are, as humans, for example, our nature is to reach the best version of ourselves through something called eudaimonia, which is like the good self.
Sure.
And by doing by exemplifying ourselves by following the key four virtues, right? So it's like that has this kind of faceless kind of God, right? It's like it's not personified, but it's more about accepting the truth that there is a law in nature, and again, that's still beyond that horizon point, because you have to be able to accept that and agree with that for it to be of any meaning. But I want to touch back base on that in a little bit. But
it's a great question too. I mean, it's great.
Do you think so? The different religions say about, or what do different religions say about what happens after we die, and how does that play in with faith as well?
Really good question. So I'm going to start east and go west. Okay. In one form or another, there are two varieties in the Eastern religions of what happens after you die. One is the most fully transcendent form, which is whatever the self is dissipates entirely into transcendence, whatever that is. So in Taoism, the human self integrates back into the Tao. Okay, it loses entirely its defined selfhood to become part of this greater movement called the Tao. In Buddhism, it's nirvana. It loses its distinctive characteristics in the samsara world and literally becomes no thing. Okay. In Hinduism, the absorption into Brahma, into pure being or pure substance. These are always the top transcendent level. But all three religions also imagine a potential intermediate eternity in which, in Pure Land Mahayana Buddhism, the self migrates into a pure land, which is free from reincarnation and eternally studies the truth of Buddhism, right? The same thing, there's a kind of a heaven, there's a word for heaven in Hinduism, that's an intermediate state that you can attain without continual reincarnation. It's not the final goal, but it's a place that's more imaginable for humans than the final goal. Of course, in the three Western religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the beyond death is some kind of divine reign. Okay, and there's a little bit different views of that. Again, in Islam, for example, the Sufi movement, the spiritualist movement in Sufism, imagines complete absorption of the self into the divine as an ultimate goal. Okay, but popular Islam certainly teaches that there is a heaven, right? A garden in which those who die after they are judged, and if they are judged worthy, go and live eternity in a perfect, pure garden with other perfect, pure people and entirely oriented towards God, which is their human vocation to start with. Christianity has a wide variety of popular conceptions of heaven and what it's like. But again, Christian mystics would have, like Islamic mystics and Jewish mystics, talked about absorption into God. The more mundane idea would be the New Jerusalem, the kingdom of God, a perfect place in which individuals retain somehow their identity and yet now oriented entirely toward God. I just read a column by a Jewish writer named Martin Sykes. Basically, he hoped debunking the ideas that Jews have no idea of an afterlife.
Right.
And he said that's popular misconception, but also a misconception, because there's always the idea of living in the blessed memory of the community, at the very least.
Right.
Orthodox Judaism imagines a full-throated heaven, but even Reformed and conservative Judaism would imagine there's a life after death in the memory of the community. So those are some of the differences. It's interesting to me that all of them have a kind of a double layer, and one layer is complete absorption into the transcendence, into God, Tien, Brahma, Allah. And the other is the much more imaginable, beyond this reality that we experience, something better.
Right.
Right.
How would you, I guess, differentiate the two from our own understandings as humans? Differentiating absorption into God seems different than our self being in a heaven, a place of right, like a place where our bodies are there and we're experiencing this utopia. Whether it's our spirits or whatever that means. But that I think we can wrap our head around more because it's more tangible because we've experienced this life and we know what that's like. But the absorption into God, what does that mean?
So the basis of all of those ideas, and this is why mystics all can talk to each other. Buddhist mystics, Christian mystics, Muslim mystics, they all have something to say. We can't even begin to get at the mystic vision of absorption into God or the Godhead without beginning to imagine the dissolution of our sense of ourselves. Right. It's just so much in us that I'm a me.
Right.
That I'm a self. I'm a something.
Right.
And that I can't imagine my own non-existence. I can't imagine not existing. So the only thing I can imagine is me existing
somewhere else,
right, in a more exalted form. It's not clear whether. Well, I'm going to mention an interesting book by Justin Gregg called "If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal." So Justin Gregg studies animal intelligence, and at least part of his thesis in this very entertaining book is the idea that because we cannot we humans are the only creatures we know of that cannot imagine having a self and then imagine not having a self.
Right.
Okay. Which turns out to be unimaginable. So he says we project ourselves in the future. He's not a fan of religion, and he's not sure it's good for us. Right. He thinks we might be better off being a narwhal because our other choice is Nietzsche. Not a happy man.
Right. Well, it's the curse of being able to question our own existence.
Our own existence, right. Yeah. I'll just offer from my personal perspective, having taught students who are going into Christian ministry for a long time and taught religions and been engaged in interreligious dialogue for a very long time. At a very practical level, few of us are cut out for mysticism. Okay. And so an academic or a scholar or a mystic can sit back and go, well, you're just very naive. Right. Your projection of yourself into this idyllic future, which in, like some Christian symbolism is beautiful hills in the Rockies and a little cabin with a little light in it.
Right.
That they would say that's just naive. Okay, but I'm not sure what naive means here, because transcendence, by definition, is not anything like reality as we know it.
Right.
All our visions are naive. We've just got a little human mind.
Right. We just can't conceive of it.
We can't conceive of it.
Right.
So for someone who thinks they have a more exalted vision of this, to criticize the person who says, I just want to go home and be with Jesus, what does that mean?
Right.
You're relative to whatever transcendence is, the mystic's view is as naive as the child.
Right.
And maybe that's a better place to start.
Well, I guess the difference is in the acceptance of knowing that you don't know, which seems a lot kind of agnostic in a sense, like that the mystic idea that we just can't comprehend what is beyond there. That spiritual aspect seems, in that sense, slightly agnostic, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it is. Yeah. I would say there's a positive aspect of that agnosticism, which is if we recognize the limitations of our own understanding, we can be more open to the understandings of other religious people.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah.
And maybe even understand the frustrations of people who are just hard-on atheists.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's funny how I'm going to want to talk about dogmatism in that sense, because I think both, extreme sides, and that's unfortunately the case with any kind of religion or anything that can have where we cling our identity to,
right,
can lead towards these extreme kind of dogmatic ideas where religious people and atheists butt head because they think their way is right. No different than like vegans and carnivores, in that whole diet community. I want to talk about religion and crime. It's kind of an interesting topic I was thinking about, but there was a couple of other Pew Research studies that suggested that the correlation between religion and moral behavior and crime avoidance may be more influenced by socioeconomic factors. Yeah. So do you think religion plays a direct role in reducing crime, or is it more about community accountability or socioeconomic factors?
Yeah, I'm going to say the latter. I don't think there's any good evidence that being religious makes you less likely to be a criminal. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence I would offer as a religious person working in religious communities that there's plenty of room to be a criminal and be religious. Sure. And I think the teaching of the great religious teachers, down through the ages, has been that merely believing something, merely being scared of punishment after death, doesn't change our moral behavior. There's some kind of inner transformation that religion aims to assist in and guide with that would change that. But it's not guaranteed that joining a religious community or even accepting and saying, say, the Ten Commandments is going to change the way I actually behave. There's a million justifications for breaking the moral law. Sure. And so I think it's more likely that once one, and this is very Aristotelian, by the way, Nicomachean ethics, I think it's much more likely that because you are involved in a community that has standards for behavior and that these are integrated very early into the way in which a child is raised and their self-expectations, that these kinds of religious communities, being a member of such a religious community is going to shape your moral nature and behavior, but through the acceptance of what's acceptable to your parents, your siblings, your friends, your neighbors, and this sort of thing, to at least make us question, before I do something, right, what would my mother say? What would my father say? And because I'm asking that question, what would my mother or father say, in the context of us all being religious, it's a similar question of what would my religion say, right?
Right.
But so I think we're socialized to be good. When we're grown up enough, we can begin to be conscious about internalizing our ethics, right? And seek guidance where we find it. But my own experience working really most of my life outside of a Christian majority country is that people with no religion and of all religions are equally likely to be both moral and immoral. There are extremely moral, ethical atheists.
Right.
And there are extremely immoral, unethical Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus.
Do you think that's so? Would you say socioeconomics play more of a factor in that case? In the case, for example, like Honduras or Guatemala, where there's a high level of faith, but the socioeconomic landscape is a lot of poor. How would you explain the disconnect? Is it because of the socioeconomic disparity?
Are you talking about the correlation between religious faith and poverty, or are you talking about the religious faith and immorality? Yeah,
more along the lines of how much of the role does poverty play in immorality versus religion. Yeah.
So I'm going to offer you an anecdote that can be checked out for fact. In the main square in Old Havana in Cuba, this is a place I've taken groups for many times, there is a striking statue. And this statue dates or was created to remember the time in the 90s when the Soviet Union broke apart. Cuba lost the kind of support it was getting from the Soviet Union, and in its desperate economic situation turned to tourism. But not U.S. tourism, that was forbidden.
Right.
So it was getting a lot of Eastern European tourism and Australian tourism. And this quickly developed into sex tourism. Okay. And a large sex tourism trade grew up in the 90s and the early 2000s in Cuba as extremely desperate women turned to prostitution in order to feed their families in a time of desperation. Okay. Eventually, the Castro government made some changes, reined things in, changed the tourism spectrum, et cetera. Things got much better, although things are bad now, but things got much better, and at least in that respect, Cuba returned to being a more normal society vis-a-vis the prostitution, which is in every society, including Dallas, right?
Right.
Well, a well-known Cuban sculptor was commissioned to do something to remember the women who had sold their bodies in order to feed their children. And so there is a remarkable, huge statue, a over life-size statue of a rooster on which is sitting a naked woman with a fork. She's wearing shoes. She's stunning. The rooster is pretty stunning and huge. And of course, it's a visual joke. She fed her children by riding a cock.
Wow.
Wow. Exactly. Wow. Every time I take a group of students, they go,
all right.
Okay.
So this is literal.
This is literal. It's a joke.
Yeah, that's great.
But it's also a tribute to these women. And I think it recognizes something important, that conventional morality will always go out the window when it's a matter of survival.
Right. When our basic needs are not met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Jesus says something about this, but very rare are the people who will sacrifice their lives for a moral principle. That humans will sacrifice their lives for someone else, yes. Okay. But to die for a principle, this is extraordinarily rare.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing is true of societies and institutions. It's true of states, nation states. No nation state willingly ceases to exist in order to uphold some kind of vague principle about democracy or pacifism or whatever. So I do think socioeconomics play a huge role here. What is acceptable, things become acceptable that would not normally be acceptable because we have to survive. On ships lost at sea and immobile, cannibalism becomes a thing.
Yeah, that's kind of hard to kind of reconcile the two. Is that if Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if those needs aren't met, humans can do some pretty bad things, and even those who have a lot of faith, it's kind of
even people of extreme faith will look. There's many a parent who would sacrifice their own life to save their child, or who would do something immoral to save their child, for that matter. But I don't know of a parent who would sacrifice their child to keep a moral principle. And in fact, if I met that person, I'd want to lock them up right away.
Right. Abraham was willing to do, or was going to do it.
Well, this is interesting. Abraham was going to, this is one of the toughest stories in the Bible. Right? Is Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac just because God told him to.
Right.
Now, the Talmudic scholars, the Jewish scholars and Christian scholars wrestle with this one all the time. And we don't have time to to do a full-on exegesis of this as if I was an expert. But I do think that the story as it's told ends up with God basically telling Abraham, "You idiot, do you think I ask people to kill their children?"
Right. It was, yeah.
You were mistaken and you need to gut it up, brother.
Right.
Get your moral principles in order. Even if God...
You were going to actually do that?
You can actually do it, yeah. If you think God told you to sacrifice your child, then you need to get another God.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Because this is also, and we go back to the Old Testament, this is the sin of Moloch. The sacrificing of children is the most fundamental sin.
Right.
And so, as complicated as that story is, I think it's actually not that complicated.
Right.
If your God tells you to sacrifice children, then go get another God.
Right. Yep, that makes sense. So I want to circle back to Stoicism and philosophy.
Sure.
I was raised Jewish in a Jewish household. I was bar mitzvahed. I went to a Catholic school when I lived in France. I went to a Jewish school when I lived in Australia. Yeah. So I've kind of been exposed to a lot. My dad was raised Jewish. My mom was raised Jewish, and then they converted to Christian. They were raised Christian. She converted to Judaism when she was young, close to being a teenager, roughly. And I don't know if it's because I've been exposed to a lot of religion, but I've always had a hard time believing in an omnipotent being,
right?
That we were talking about earlier, that omnipresent, personified version of what God is, that most people on earth kind of espouse. And so I was struggling with finding what God was to me. And so through discovering Stoic philosophy, it's really kind of changed my life in a lot of ways. And I'm still delving into it. It's only been, 6 or not that even long, 4 months since I've gone into it, but it's really has made a huge difference on my life and really changed my perspective on a lot of things. And a lot of people think of philosophy as these abstract ideas that college students get together and they wax poetic on the fields. But I'm going to quote Seneca, who was a big Stoic philosopher. He said, "Philosophy is not merely an abstract intellectual exercise, but a practical guide to living a good and meaningful life. Philosophy should teach us how to deal with life's challenges, cultivate inner peace, and live virtuously. It helps us to prepare for the inevitable hardships of life, such as suffering, loss, and death, by fostering resilience, wisdom, courage, and self-control, which are the big 4 virtues. The true value of philosophy lies in its ability to shape our character and guide our actions towards a life in harmony with nature and reason."
Right.
So do you need to follow, do you think, a specific religion to be considered religious, or can philosophy provide that similar guidance?
Such a good question. And I just want to say, by the way, I very much appreciate your complicated religious upbringing. We have a complex family too. So my wife's father was a convert to Christianity from traditional Chinese religions. Okay. My daughter is married to a rather secularized Austrian Jew. His mother was a Catholic convert to Judaism when she married his father, and his father and his second wife now live in Israel. So they were Viennese though to the core. So we have complicated family Christmases. In the sense that if the parents are in town, we can do Shabbat on Friday, and if Christmas falls on Sunday, then we're over with his stepsister with a totally traditional Austrian Christmas where you light candles on a Christmas tree and sing
"Same for
O
Us."
Tannenbaum. Yeah, you get the idea. Which is good. So back to the philosophy. I think Seneca is exactly right. What one could say, looking at sort of the history of why religions work, is that philosophies have rarely been able to create a large and growing community of people who together pursue something as a social activity, right? it has happened in the past.
Right.
There were groups of Stoics. There were meetings of Stoics. There were Stoic dinner parties. But they couldn't. The philosophy could not turn itself into a full-blown religion.
Do you think Christianity had something to do with that, based on the timing? Because it was like right around the same time.
It was around the same time, and what Christianity did, in my view, one of many things it did, is Christianity absorbed philosophy. So there's a great deal of Stoicism in parts of the Christian New Testament, and a great deal more in the theology that develops in the 300 to 400 years after that. So Christianity absorbs sort of the best of Stoic philosophy into its own cult, and it also absorbs the Roman religious culture, the civic religion of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that becomes a very potent mixture. So you have this teaching about the resurrection of Jesus and the possibility of eternal life, something a little more concrete than philosophical ideas. You can still get the full-on Stoic philosophy.
4 cardinal virtues.
The 4 cardinal virtues and all of this. And you can participate in the civic life of the state and the city, all at once. That's a potent combination. At the same time, there always were, and there always will be people for whom the discovery of Stoicism or one of the other great philosophies, is an enlightening experience. It says, well, here's a way I can, it seems like what you're discovering, right? Here's a way I can orient myself within the reality I experience, including the world of nature and who I am and who my neighbors are, that cultivates all of these things, virtues, self-control, fortitude, and suffering, right? This gives me those things.
Right.
Without requiring that I associate myself with a dubious or untrustworthy religious community.
Well, not just that, but more so in my case, the personification of a God, right? That this, whether it's Jesus or it's too, to me, it seems just too man-made. Like the idea that this, because it's so close to humans, it's more kind of similar in line to the mystics of afterlife, right?
Right.
Whether you're gonna walk in a garden and be yourself as a spirit versus, we don't quite know, but we know that there's something beyond that horizon, right? So in this case, it's similar in that it's hard for me to espouse something that is too personified and too man-made. So I'm more in line with the idea that God is the logos, it's the laws of nature, and this is how we're meant to be. And I'm happy to leave it at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this, by the way, gets to where the Christians managed to absorb this, because in the beginning of the Gospel of John, Jesus, the Christ, is referred to as the eternal logos.
Did not know that.
Yeah. It begins, in the beginning was the Word, the logos, and the Word, the logos, was God, theos, and the logos was with the theos, okay? And then the logos comes to earth to be Jesus. Okay. So now, if you're a Stoic Greek, and you go, oh, well, I get it. You're just calling Jesus
a Stoic, essentially.
A Stoic, yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say, I think, again, across my experience with people of different religions, that eventually a lot of people have trouble with the personification of God. Okay. Because every personification of God has the possibility of becoming idolatrous,
right?
And by which I define not sort of the stupid, naive idolatry of worshiping a statue,
right?
But the more specific idolatry of being exclusive, right? This God as a person is God who is bounded, and who therefore cannot seem to embrace the totality of all things that are. And this is, for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, this has been a rich source of theological speculation for 2,000 years.
Right.
Well, for Muslims, 1,400. But it's not surprising to me that you or anybody else would say, I find this personification of God troubling. Okay. In the same way that I'll just say for myself personally, I know people who are extremely attached to a guru or a religious teacher. Mm-hmm. This is this person to whom they really feel like being. When I'm with this person, I'm in the presence of something bigger, more meaningful, more truthful, etc. They have a deep emotional attachment. And I just can't even get there, and I can't even imagine why I would want to.
Right.
I don't want a guru.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. But why do you think, because most people follow or focus on this omnipotent figure,
right?
Whether it's Allah or Jesus or God in Judaism. So why do you think there is such a focus on the omnipotent being rather than just their teachings?
Really good question. I'm trying to think of which perspective to answer it from. I'm going to offer you two. Okay. I think if we looked at the scientific study of religion, Religionswissenschaft in German, or what we do in religious studies departments, so Clifford Geer's, Talalasa, they would say that through the period of human evolution, okay, we gradually learn to personify a lot of things, okay, to recognize each other as persons, but also to some extent to personify animals, creatures, right? Most people believe the dog is pretty much like them in some way. Mm-hmm. So we anthropomorphize, we chat with our dogs.
Right.
We don't think of them as gods, by the way.
Right.
But the flip side of that is when we see something happening that appears purposeful or willful, the laws of nature, the sun coming up, our tendency, I think we have evolved for this, our tendency is to attribute that appearance of orderliness and rationality to a person.
Right.
And so if there is an orderliness or rationality to nature, then we are going to attribute this to nature's God, some kind of personification of the deity. Mm. That would be one sort of explanation. Another one, I think, is that we simply and I don't mean to be demeaning by this because theologians are better than I have explored it thoroughly, but there's a tendency, if we're the biggest, most intelligent personality we know, then we project the attributes of ourself onto whatever is transcendent.
Right.
If it's intelligent, then it must be kind of super intelligent.
Right.
If it has feelings, it must be super feelings. Or Aristotle would have said, it is the perfection of all that we know. But that means it's the perfection of our own imperfection.
Right. So projecting our ego into it.
We project it into it, I think, to some extent.
Yeah.
And we're all, by the way, religious people, at least in the monotheistic religions, see this as idolatry and therefore try to problematize it and continually deconstruct it. But we're always in a battle back and forth with this.
Right.
Do we make it something easy for us to see and relate to? Mm-hmm. So it means it's sub-God, but a little more human.
Right.
Or do we make it so vacuous, nebulous, and ethereal and idealized that we can't get a grip on it?
Right. So you think that the personification is just an easier way for us to grasp it and understand it in that sense?
Yeah, I would tend to go along with a guy named James Fowler. He wrote a book on faith development, who in his rather complex structuring says the structure of our faith tends to change through time. And without any judgment about better or worse, when we reach a certain age or have certain mental capabilities for abstraction, we have the capability of moving onward toward a sort of a mystical or encompassing view. Mm-hmm. Whether that's better or not, he thinks he can track that to 6 stages of faith development. But I think this is the psychology of that is insightful.
Mm-hmm.
That how far our faith moves in the direction of a truly universal transcendent, which would be what the Stoics are trying to get at.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Depends on the continued development of certain capacity to imagine.
Right. Yeah. Which kind of comes in line with what we were saying earlier about secularism, because I think secularism has become more predominant as science has helped us see things. The sun's rising because we're rotating around it,
Right.
As opposed to personifying it because we don't understand it, right?
Right.
So do you think, I think there's a study that said most people aren't dogmatic about their faith.
Right.
And so they don't think that their religion is the only way to salvation.
Right.
And I think if you ask somebody this a couple hundred years ago, the answer would be vastly different.
Yeah.
Because of this rise in secularism
Sure.
and science, probably. But do you think that this is a sign of like weakening religiousness, or do you think it's just a society as we're becoming more spiritual?
That's a good, and let's make the distinction then between being spiritual and being religious,
Mm-hmm.
right? I would say if your culture offered you essentially a very limited number of ways of being spiritual, okay, so the what you could be and how you could understand God was really limited to what was within the religious framework of your culture.
Mm-hmm.
Also bear in mind that until the modern era, most people didn't have time to think about stuff like this.
Right.
They were working 12 hard hours a day to get enough food on the table to survive and get through the winter. So yes, they went to mass. If we're in Europe, right? They go to mass or they go to the synagogue once a week. They chant their prayers and stuff, and then it's back to work. Philosophy's a game for the rich. We've gradually gained the freedom and time to begin to imagine and be creative and think outside those dogmatic boxes. And secularism rises in this same period of prosperity. With that, I think we have the freedom now to question the dogmas
Mm-hmm.
that limited us, and secularism creates the social space to do that. And that's been happening for 100 years.
Right.
But I think Charles Taylor points out it becomes a widely available option only in the latter part of the 20th century.
Right.
Okay. And I think about just an example of this. In my teenage years, I lived in Richardson, Texas, so it's north here. Well, we're in Irving, right?
Right.
Over to the east. It called itself a city of churches. The major industries were IBM, Texas Instruments, and some other tech industries and banking. Okay. No matter where you were socially, if you lived in Richardson, you were going to be in church on Sunday. And it was church. There was a relatively small Catholic community. There was there was a large Jewish community that was outside of Richardson. It was up on Hillcrest Road.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that wasn't part of Richardson, strictly speaking. And I don't think Beth Torah over in Canyon Creek even existed yet. So you were going to be religious in a certain way. You were going to be Christian.
Right.
And it behooved you, if you thought you were going to get ahead in business, if you were going to advance at TI, if you were going to move up, behooved you to be in your three-piece suit in church on Sunday somewhere.
Mm.
Preferably First Baptist or First United Methodist. Right? Because those were the big dogs. But it could be the others too, Church of Christ, Presbyterian, Episcopal. That has certainly changed.
I think that's I think that's a good thing.
Well, I think it's a good thing too.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that social pressure necessarily created good religious people.
Absolutely. Completely agree.
Right?
Right.
But another way to look at that is, as society opened up, people, and I'm going to say particularly people my age and a little bit younger, realized that they had a choice. And that choice could be just, I'm not going to church, so I'm going to sleep late. The choice could also be, Well, I'm going to read more deeply and think about stuff. I'm going to see if I can't chart my own course. Maybe it would be a choice to find a kind of a spirituality in the growing number of alternatives. So I think my generation, maybe the generation before, generations after, deeply influenced by the world that was created by J.R.R. Tolkien. Okay. C.S. Lewis, Star Wars.
Yeah.
Okay. So these were huge worlds, each of which had a distinctive spirituality, right? And very intentionally in the case of Tolkien and Lewis. Mm-hmm. Really with George Lucas too, certainly in the original Star Wars.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people that gave an alternative way of exploring who am I, what's my relationship to God, good and evil, how do I make choices, right? That I could now explore without the dogma of Orthodox Judaism or Orthodox Christianity or something like that.
Well, and I guess I haven't read enough of the Bible to know this, but I would say that, would you think that the religious teachings in the Bible have a dogmatic teaching?
Ooh, such a terrifically good question. You don't mind if I say yes and no, okay? If one simply reads through the Christian Bible, so I'm going to include the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, our Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, Jewish Scripture, Christian Scripture. If you start at page 1 and you read straight through it, okay, 99% of it's narrative. Maybe not 99, 95% is narrative. It's stories. And it is the stories that elucidate possible ways of being human in the world, in relationship to God always, right? But it's stories, and they're pretty non-dogmatic. In fact, often they're complicated, like the Abraham and Isaac story.
They don't offer its interpretation. It's just this is the story. Now you must.
This is a story. You're going to have to figure it out.
Right.
They don't lend themselves to easy dogma.
Yeah.
And they're complicated. Is King David a hero or a villain? Well, he kills a guy to get his wife. And yet he's the greatest.
Right.
Or there's Solomon. Solomon's kind of the second greatest. He builds the temple, but he's also got 1,000 wives and 1,000 horses. Mm-hmm. The stories are complicated, and they invite complex reflection on what it means to be human in relationship to God. However, eventually, all of these stories, these narratives, depending on the religious tradition and how it plays out, will fall into the hands of professionals, of people for whom it is important that the community have fixed standards of belief and practice, and therefore they need to be turned into dogma.
Right. And I do want to talk the human ego and the duality of religion in that sense too.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead. But I think that's the short story.
Yeah.
I'm a professional. My degree, my PhD is actually history, so maybe I'm a biased person. But I work in a school that depends on the teaching of dogma. Our class of people that make up our school are dogmaticians. We draw our salary from it, and we train people to be dogmaticians. Okay? Clearly, we have a vested interest.
Right.
But it does occur to me often that we should step back and go, is that ideal?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think about again, I'm not too versed on the Bible, and I should read it just to get more of an education in it. But in the New Testament, saying if you don't believe in God, you're going to hell,
right?
Essentially, and it's very easy for humans for us to read that and interpret it as, well, then you must be a Christian. I want to save my friend. I don't want my friend to die and go to hell. So in cases like that, I can definitely see it's just as clear as day. This is going to lead itself to an interpretation of saying, well, God, you have to believe in Jesus or be Christian, because you will go to hell if you die.
It's actually really difficult if one reads and let's just stick with the New Testament for a minute, because the Old Testament's complex in the Jewish understanding. It's really hard to actually read through the New Testament and come to the conclusion that you have to believe in God or you'll go to hell. That's actually just not there.
Okay.
That is what professional theologians shook out of it as part of their effort to build coherent communities that had some kind of motivation to get other people involved, and also this sort of thing. I'm not dissing them. I don't think they had bad intentions.
Right.
I think they thought they were saying what they heard. But in reality, it's a great deal more complicated than that. But now what happens is, as Christians, right, we don't read the New Testament anymore. We read the New Testament through the ideas of the dogma that someone has taught us. And so we miss the parts that violate the dogma, right? We just skim over them.
Right.
And we're highlighted.
Right.
We highlight the parts that confirm what our preacher said.
It's like it's like editing of a news source, right? Or someone gets quoted and out of context.
Sure.
Essentially.
Well, I mean, I'm going to give an example, and I'll make it as apolitical as I possibly can. But if all you do is watch late night comedy shows that are political satire, okay, then all you're getting is sound clips,
right,
from different political candidates,
yeah,
which then someone makes fun of. So now my mental representation of who that person is, has come from 10 sound bites, carefully selected for the comedic purposes.
Right.
Okay. Now I go, okay, well, listen, I better watch a whole hour of this guy speaking or this woman speaking, because I know I've just gotten sound bites. But the filters are already built in.
Right.
I'm going to watch for an hour, but what's going to jump out at me are the sound bites I've already been shown. And I think this happens in almost all our religious communities. I think pastors and religious teachers would say, no, my job is, in fact, to explode those myths and get people to see the whole thing. But I'm not sure we do it very well.
Right. That makes sense. I want to keep talking about that human ego.
Yeah, the human ego thing. Yeah.
Because that kind of falls in line with again, this dogmatic approach to religion. Religion's created a bunch of good: charity, education, art, the flourishing of civilizations, but it's also been used to justify terrible things, the Crusades, religious extremism. So do you think it's the human ego that distorts the essence of religion, turning something that can be pure into something, a tool used for harm?
Yeah. First of all, the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim analysis would be, although they don't use the term ego in the way we mean it today, would say something like that. Yes.
Yeah.
You have something potentially very, very, very good. Human egos distort it to serve their own needs and purposes.
Right.
I would want to frame this a little more largely, though, because that's a very individualistic view. And I think within every society of any sort, and I don't just mean like a national society, but I mean any community, like a religious community or otherwise, you can develop a certain pathology that is a communal pathology. It's not just one ego.
Right.
It's the whole community agreeing together
right.
that it's going to do these bad things or say these bad things, or that these bad things are justified for our protection. And so I think when we're thinking about ourselves as humans in society, we need to identify the ego for sure. But we need to look at these social pathologies as well,
right? Because
those have to be excised if we're going to be better people.
Yeah, that's seemingly impossible to do.
It's extremely difficult, and yet I've got to say, I mean, I'm a historian professionally. I've read a lot. Okay. We're living in better times than the human race has ever had before.
Absolutely.
relative to our ideals, we may be falling well short. But the very fact that we have ideals is something.
Right.
Right? But, I mean, I don't want to be maudlin about this. My father died of a brain cancer that would be easily operable. That was in 1968. If he lived today, he would not die.
Right.
Okay? I had a malignant melanoma on my leg. It was spotted and taken off 27 years ago. So I'm still alive because that's a bad malignancy.
Mm-hmm.
Still alive. 50 years before that, it would have just killed me.
Right.
And on and on and on. There was a time before penicillin.
Right.
You know.
Right. And who knows where it's going to project into the future with technology.
Look, I'm sitting here. I have an artificial heart valve. The diagnosis that led to the open heart surgery and replacement of that valve, if it had happened in 1950, would have said, you need to sit in an easy chair and enjoy the rest of your life because you're going to slowly die.
Mm.
We can't do anything for you. So medically, much better. Despite the massive problem of starvation and migration, okay, fewer of us starve now than starved in the 50s.
Right.
So I don't think we should be hopeless about this.
Mm-hmm.
We can excise some of our social pathologies. Maybe I give one more example?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then I know you have another question.
Yeah.
Well, from the time I arrived back in Dallas in 2004, because of my past history, I became very involved in interreligious dialogue, especially Christian-Muslim dialogue, but also Christian-Muslim-Jewish dialogue, Buddhists, Hindus, etc. And, 2004, this is after 9/11. There's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in the U.S. These were tough times for Muslims being Muslims. And there were people who were interested in interfaith dialogue and interreligious dialogue and better interreligious understanding that I was able to work with. And I'm going to mention a few names just because if I forget to mention everybody, but I should mention a few of them. Almas Muskatwala and the Ismaili community, very dedicated to this. Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who now lives in Israel, but he comes back to the U.S., but was very involved in helping us do work in Muslim, Christian, Jewish dialogue. Imam Kavakchi of the Richardson Mosque, the imams of the mosques in Plano and in Irving as well, other Jewish leaders, names escaping me now, Rabbi Raskin, Temple Beth Torah. Okay, I'm leaving people out, and I don't intend to. But all these people worked together and said, let's create, I'll mention George Mason, Nancy Kasten. All these people worked together to get people into the same room to talk, to understand each other better religiously. As importantly, I was able to write dozens and dozens of blog posts, articles, op-ed articles for the Dallas Morning News, calling out a downtown pastor who was spewing anti-Islamic hatred. Okay, we got traction socially. And so when armed gunmen decided that they would march on a Friday outside a mosque in Richardson, Christians and Jews also showed up to say, this isn't us. Mm. People should worship freely here. Now, fast forward till 6-7 years ago. I was chatting with Almas actually about this. And at the time feeling we'd initiated a couple of efforts that didn't come off very well in dialogue and stuff. And I'm just going, it was all this work we've been doing, blah, blah, blah. And she pointed out, and she was right. She said, we changed it. Mm. In the city of Dallas, we made it unacceptable to be violently anti-Islamic.
Yeah.
Now, I say we. It was a big we. But we shifted the city. Now, that's a very small thing, and Muslims still suffer this, and now we've got a massive anti-Semitism problem.
Right.
Okay. But if we see the social pathology, we can address it and change it.
Yeah.
Right.
That's that's exactly what I was going to ask you. My next question is how can communities prevent the ego from taking over and making sure their practices and beliefs stay focused on compassion instead of being used for violence and division? And this is an exact example of how that can help do that. And the problem is having the time and the resources in order to create this change, for the anti-Semitic sentiments that are going on right now, for example, having to, because it all starts with your community. It's not going to be, maybe you can create some sort of giant online, social media thing, but at the end of the day, I think the biggest change is going to come through the community in which you live.
I think that's absolutely right. And I'll add one thing to this. It's quite difficult for us to maintain our violent bigotry if we know each other face to face and our neighbors and know each other better.
Right.
And I don't mean neighbors in walled communities like too many of our suburbs. I mean neighbors where we see each other and we talk each other face to face. A writer named Konrad Lorenz, very influential in my university days, so it's a long time ago, 70s, wrote a book called On Aggression. And the gist of this book, as I remember it, was that there's no natural species of mammal, at least, and that's what he studied. There's no natural species of mammal that kill their own. Okay, we have ways of looking each other in the face and go, I can't do that. So that when you find a person who can kill a person face to face, then that's pathological. That's genuinely pathological.
Right.
So to encourage face-to-face interaction with people who are different than us is a key way of then humanizing one another.
Sure.
Understanding each other as humans.
Right.
Now, Lorenz's point, and this gets right to our social media pathology, is that the creation of modern warfare, it's not like humans couldn't kill each other, by the way. We're certainly capable of doing it.
It's so impersonal today.
Right. But the advent of modern warfare was killing at a greater and greater distance.
Right. That's what makes it less personal.
Right.
Too.
And that makes it much less personal.
Right.
So there's no longer the sort of chivalrous code of the medieval period, where the person I'm facing is someone I see, someone like me, right? There's a distance. We could trace the whole history of this, but I believe it's in the Henry II by Shakespeare. He talks about this famous defeat of the French, but the defeat of the French by the British on the battlefield begins when the French archers, okay, now we have a long distance thing, kill the drummer boys, behind the lines. But the English archers also have their longbows. They can also kill at a distance. Okay, and so this is the beginning of non-chivalrous warfare. This is warfare fought where I don't see the enemy.
Right.
And it just gets more and more with the invention of the rifle, the gun. We're all the face-to-face stuff until we have modern drone attacks and bombings. There's a stunning Doonesbury cartoon, talk about a blast of the past, that perfectly captures this back in the Vietnam War. At the time, the United States was bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went up through Cambodia. So we were bombing territories that were not part of Vietnam with whom we were fighting war. And a lot of that destruction was simply invisible. I mean, it was just you bombed the trail. So what the author of Doonesbury catches is a moment in which first we see bombs dropping on a village in Cambodia, people running and fleeing. They're getting killed, okay, by these bombs. And then we cut to the cockpit of the B-52 bomber. And the pilot says to the co-pilot, "Did you catch the Giants game last week?" So this is completely impersonal.
Right.
The act of killing has become completely depersonalized.
You don't even know if you're killing anybody. I mean, that case
you don't
like
even know
that.
if you're killing
You're
anybody.
just like a longbow.
You were given these coordinates and you drop the bombs.
Right.
Right. Now, that Doonesbury was not being fair to those pilots. They understood the destruction they were creating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But it was an apt point about what happens when the decision to kill gets separated from the face-to-face interaction.
Yeah.
We have to get back to having face-to-face relations with one another.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And social media is the exact opposite of that.
Right, yeah. I mean, that's just, so warfare on a smaller scale. You're not actually killing somebody, but the things that people get away with saying to one another with the veil of the screen.
Completely abstract.
Yeah.
Completely abstract.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed when we began having, we began using online discussion forums in classes at SMU.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes back 15 years or so. And at first, this looked like a great idea. We'll be able to extend class discussions outside of the classroom.
Sure.
Right? And students can engage in a more robust discussion. And what I instantly noticed was that, and by the way, in those days, the class discussions didn't have any face or anything like this as primitive technology.
Right.
What I instantly noticed was that the discussions that would have been perfectly rational theological discussions in the classroom turned toxic in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as some young person, typically testosterone-laden young man, is making his theological point,
Mm-hmm.
but he's just typing it in, and all he knows is RC said something he didn't like.
Right.
Okay. Absent any face-to-face, man, he goes bad fast.
Right.
He's as vicious as he wants to be because he doesn't know who he's talking to anymore.
Yeah.
And I quit using the discussion boards. I said, this invariably leads to a toxic discussion.
For sure. Yeah. And not only can so much be lost in translation too, because that does happen, right? But
we didn't have emojis.
Barring barring that, even with emojis, it's just like they do help. But barring that, things getting lost in translation, people are so quick to be able to just jump down each other's throats because there's no face to face. And the problem is, so in going back to the question about changing, taking the ego out and changing societies for the better and doing these movements to help unify ourselves and taking the ego out of religion, it seems like this is a losing battle in that sense because we are just going to be more and more separated from one another because so much, especially in younger kids, so much interaction is taking place on social media. Their entire social outlet, unfortunately, and you can, I blame parents, but you can blame whatever you want. Their social interactions are predominantly online through a screen, which is crazy to me. And I completely agree with the need to do this, but I'm worried about that is an inevitability. Yeah. I don't know. Hopefully there's some sort of kind of renaissance and change that can help reverse this, as there's an ebb and flow, of course. But I'm kind of pessimistic about that.
Well, so I'm much less pessimistic.
Good. Thank you.
A couple of reasons. A guy named Richard Haight, Haight, wrote a book on the influence of adolescents and teenagers on of social media, okay, particularly in schools. And the book's been much discussed. I can't think of the title of it now, but Richard Haight, you can look it up. One thing it led to was, quickly, one of the things he discovered was in his research, and I think I'm accurate in this, is he said, if we ask teenagers, people in grades 7 through 12, and if we gave you $100, would you give up your cell phone in school for a day? And the answer was no way. I'd be out of touch in a heartbeat.
Mm.
I would be the lone person that has no idea what's going on. Okay, they just wouldn't do it. It's too important to them socially. On the other hand, they asked the question, if we gave you $100, if we banned cell phones in the schools, would you pay us? And 80% of the kids said, yeah, we would pay you if you took away every one of them. Preferentially, we'd rather be face-to-face. But I can't be the one that's left out if it's all on social media.
Right.
Now, this has led to some schools banning, and whole states was finding some way or another to ban the phones in public places. There's a debate about this, how to do it effectively. I think we will find one. it'll start with private schools rather than public schools. But I'm hopeful that I think that young people know that they've got a bad relationship through this, but it's hard to give up, right? I mean,
for adults even.
Yeah. I mean, I knew kids in high school. I was in the marching band, so I've always played musical instruments my whole life, but much like you. But yeah, I knew kids in high school who hated going to football games. They didn't understand football. They didn't like football. They didn't want to go there. They just didn't dare not show up on Friday night.
Right.
Because everybody was going to be there.
Thing, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was the same thing. My church used to have ice skating parties. I can't stand ice skating. I was raised in Texas.
Right.
Okay? But I had to go.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're not there.
Right.
So I think I'm more hopeful in the sense that we will find a way to relate more helpfully to our devices.
Right.
But it will take a social effort, and parents are going to be absolutely key.
Mm-hmm.
Parents have to quit making ridiculous excuses and buy in. Maybe parents need to get off their phones too.
Yeah, absolutely. For me personally, and I think kind of paradoxically, I think technology itself can help us manage this. So I'll give you an example. One of the reasons why I took that pause from the podcast was because I hate social media, because it was part of, if you want to get your podcast out there, you've got to post on Instagram, TikTok, everywhere, right?
I know this? Yes.
Yeah. So maybe this will be used to you as well. I'm using this AI service called Opus Clip, and essentially it can take a long form video, like a 2-hour podcast, and scan all the dialogue and create short reels from this, depending on the length that you choose it to be, 30 seconds, 3 minutes, whatever. Right. And then it creates all the subtitles, it creates the hashtags, everything like that. And all you have to do is link your social accounts with those short videos, and then you can schedule them. So I can spend one day, like a Monday, scheduling all the posts for all social media accounts across the board for the week, and then I don't have to check it. And for me, that was has been a huge reason why I switched to it, because I'm like, I don't need TikTok on my phone. I don't need Instagram on my phone. I don't need it. And for me, that's been a huge relief. And I think that's using technology in a way that can help us get away from social media.
Well, I have to agree. I had not heard of Opus Clips. I've heard of some other things that do the same thing. Yeah. For my podcast, I use a social media manager for exactly the same reason.
Yeah.
I'll spend X amount of time the first day of the week, and then I don't think about it. I took Facebook off my phone a long time ago because I was tempted to post to it every time I got PO'd at something and I'm driving in my car.
Right.
So that's both dangerous and not good. So I just said, okay, forget it.
Yeah.
And instantly, without Facebook, then I still have Instagram and Threads.
Not as bad.
I just never look at them.
Yeah.
They don't interest me anymore.
Right.
I got rid of TikTok. I feel a lot better about my phone when I've eliminated the toxicity. Now, I will say there's another argument. I think it's an important argument. And I've heard this on this podcast called Hard Fork. There are kids that are marginalized, that are on the outs. It may be because of their sexuality or for some other reason, who find on social media friendships, help, advice that they cannot find in their physical social world.
Mm-hmm. Like groups on Facebook.
They find a group where they can know people like themselves and discuss problems that they genuinely have. It can perform a very valuable service there.
Yes, if you know how to use it. That's
if you know how to use
it. Yeah, that's such
it can link us together. I mean, I can now talk with my grandchildren in Austria on the phone all the time. My wife can keep up with her relatives in Malaysia. So the social media can do a lot of good things for us, but it takes wise use if it is going to do this development of our human relationships.
Right.
And I got to confess, my wife does it better than I do.
Yeah.
Somehow her Facebook feed is all positive stuff.
Right.
And mine is all crap politics.
There should be a class in school on how to manage the algorithm so that you can live a more fulfilling life.
Absolutely.
I think it's so important. Psychology.
Right. I've gotten to where I just unfriend or unfollow or delete everybody that is wounding me psychologically.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Doom scrolling's a real thing.
Sure. Yeah.
But getting back to the religious thing, this relations between religious communities, and really even to religion and spirituality. If we engage with social media in a way that continually feeds our bigotry, so that we don't have relations with real life human beings that happen to be Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or Christian, whatever.
Yeah.
Then now we're beginning to live in a fantasy world. And I should mention it's a fantasy world that is now more and more created by AI, as AI algorithms feed us our fantasies, right? They become the mirror, but it's a distorted mirror.
Right.
We look in the distorted mirror and it distorts us.
Right.
Which is why we've got to get out from that and into face-to-face. I think the other thing is spirituality takes time. Thinking philosophically takes time. The Stoic view of the world of nature and its laws, very similar to Taoism, by the way. We need to get out into nature, right? We need to make music and not just listen to music. There's a Chinese instrument called a qin. Okay, very interesting instrument. It's a 6-string zither. Okay. So it's plucked in one hand, and the strings have different tones, if you can imagine a fretboard. But you can manipulate the length of the string with another hand, the same way you would an electric guitar,
right? Like a slide guitar,
a slide guitar, or a fretless bass,
right?
But the interesting thing about it is it doesn't have a soundboard. It's the only person who can hear it played is the person playing it.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
So it was never intended for performance.
You're just feeling the vibrations essentially, or?
Well, you can hear the string.
It's just it's like an electric guitar without an amp.
Exactly. It'd be very much like an electric guitar without an amp.
Right.
You can hear it, but it was always intended to be a tool for meditation. It's a way that I, through making music, get in touch with my musical self. Okay. And the time for that, right, making the time for that is also a key part of the development of spirituality. The religious community, I think, helps.
Right.
Because it makes those times.
Right.
If it does it well. Okay. But, and it certainly creates the fellowship. But if I'm spending all of my time finding ways to prick myself to feel something by looking at my screen,
right?
Okay, then where's the time for actual contemplation?
Right.
For actually thinking about nature. There's a Warren Zevon song.
Present, yeah.
Yeah. You know Warren Zevon? Okay. No. He belongs to my generation anyway. He's passed away now. He's got a song and the line is, I'm going to go and bang my head against the wall because I'd rather feel something than nothing at all. Okay? For a lot of people, the cell phone is banging their head against the wall.
Yeah. Well, they don't even realize they're doing it, though.
No.
That's the problem.
Instead of confronting their own emptiness,
right,
and finding something to fill it,
right,
they're just watching TikTok reels.
Right.
And the more that makes them angry or happy or whatever stimulation, then they think, okay, I'm feeling something.
Right. They're at the whim. It's at the whim of their emotions are at the whim of this.
The device is creating them, and it's creating them, by the way, to sell them something.
Right. Right. or to have or to narrate a message or something.
Narrate a message. So I think your instinct is right on this. We need time. We need space. We need face-to-face communication. My hope is always that our religious communities will realize that and will find effective ways to take their message into that space. This gets back to something you said earlier, or I think asked earlier, about dogma. Dogma serves a purpose of uniting a community around a set of beliefs. We know, all of us here know what we believe, right? And that can be helpful, right? I mean, Boy Scouts have a Scout promise, Girl Scouts, These are the things we agree on. Now, okay, good. Once we've set all those things together, that takes 3.5 minutes. We can now set that aside and do everything else because we've established our commonality. if dogma becomes a means of defending the boundaries of our community so that no one else can come in,
right,
and so that we don't have to look out, then it becomes a wall.
Is dogmatic not in itself, by definition, a sense of a wall? Like, or is dogma more in its definition just the practices in which we believe? Like, is the term dogma not have a negative connotation?
I think in contemporary society it has an absolute negative connotation.
Yeah.
And I think the negative connotation is largely warranted. Now, switching hats as a teacher in a theology school, I would say dogma has the positive purpose of condensing the truth,
right,
so that we can be reminded of what's true. Okay. It just so easily slips into the negative exclusory role,
right,
where now that I know what's true, I don't have to consider any other facts.
Right. This is gospel. This is it.
This is it. This is the gospel. The Bible says it. I believe it. That settles it. Except that the Bible doesn't actually say it. That your pastor said it.
Right.
I told you the Bible said it. But yeah, that kind of thing is very, very very, very negative, I think. And to the extent that religious communities have embraced that kind of negativity, then young people justifiably stay away from them.
Right. I think it's okay to have, and there's a fine line between a dogma that's negatively impacts others and having a dogma that you have a firm belief in and are unwavering in it. I think it's okay to have a firm belief and be unwavering in it.
Right.
If it's not, negatively or impacting or hurting someone else.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's very true. And that's the it's this use of dogma as a club to club other people.
Right.
That's particularly it's bad socially, but it's also, I think, bad for us.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Prevents us from growth.
Well, you use the word wall. I think it's correct. It's a wall that means I don't have to look at you and I don't have to listen to you. Right. And that can't be helpful in an age in which we need to be humanly engaged with each other.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's hard to have an open mind, especially if you've been raised in this situation. If your entire sense of self from a very young age has been taught that this is the truth, and I think that's why I'm grateful that I was raised in this kind of multi-religious kind of household, is I was given that perspective. But for a lot of people, this is their truth. This is the gospel, and anyone beyond that, I'm shutting myself off to. Sure. Unfortunately, those situations are much harder to change because it's ingrained in who people are.
Well, and it's irrational. I mean, if we can get a little mathematical geekiness here for a minute. A very interesting mathematician named Kurt Gödel in Vienna in the 1930s responded to the work of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, a book called The Principia Mathematica. This book intended to say everything that could be said mathematically through pure symbolic logic. Okay? So it was the whole of mathematics expressed in logical form. Okay, as opposed to equations and stuff. I'm really condensing here. Okay. Gödel looked at it and had an insight. His proof took 35 pages of complex symbolic logic. We'll leave that aside. I don't understand it. Okay. And I read about it in another book called Gödel, Escher, and Bach. But Douglas Hofstadter, for your listeners. Okay. Well worth reading. Gödel's insight was this. There is one true, logically coherent statement that cannot be proven within a system of mathematics. And that statement is, this system is complete. You can only know if a system is complete from outside the system, because it's a statement about the completeness of the system.
Right.
And unless you're outside the system, you can't see that it's complete. If you're inside the system, you don't know what's outside. definitionally, you can't say the system's complete because there might be something out there that you didn't get. Right? Now, this is true or should be true of all dogma. It should begin with, this system of dogma is not complete because we're not God. We cannot transcend all human minds put together to say we know everything. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that there are theologians who will make an appeal to revelation and say, yes, but God did reveal to us that this is complete. But that in itself is nonsensical because your mind is limited in your reception of revelation. You're not God. If theologians would recognize the incompleteness of their dogmatic systems, and more importantly, if we would say that to religious people, right, the system is incomplete, then we might break out of this shell and be willing to listen to other people and our neighbors and whatever wisdom they may have to offer us. I do think that the major world religions recognize this at some level. It just often doesn't make it to the layperson, right? And maybe we all want to live in this. I want to live in my bubble, and don't tell me there's anything outside it.
Well, it might. I don't know if it's that or if it's the opposite. If it's more along the lines of what are our preconceived, because of media or preconceived notions of what religions are as a whole. We believe maybe religions are dogmatic, but individually we are a lot. You go talk to somebody face to face, and they seem a lot more. Your neighbor is going to be a lot more open minded. Sure. So I think the institutions themselves are painted. From like whether it's media or from other people on a broad spectrum, they're painted as being very dogmatic, because we like to label things, right?
Well, I think that's true. It's always the case that I'm open-minded and you're dogmatic, right? I think there's a lot to that. I think there's another part of it too. We're living in a time in which things are changing very, very rapidly. A guy named Alvin Toffler wrote a book back in the 60s or 70s, I forget which, called Future Shock. And he talked about the social and psychological impact of rapid technological change and dealing with it and what that meant for us. Well, it's 100 times worse than that now. And rapid change often makes us unsettled and nervous, and makes us not feel very good. It reminds us that everything we valued could fall apart tomorrow. And a lot of us, now I'm talking about someone my age, truth in advertising, I'm 68. A lot of my peers, a lot of people like me that grew up in Dallas, where we are now, are looking around and saying, I didn't want to live in the world I find myself in. This is not the future I imagined. Okay? In many, many ways. I didn't imagine a future in Richardson in which there would not be one mosque, but 3 mosques and 4 temples.
Right.
You talk about change. My church, First United Methodist Church, built a new campus out on Highway 75. The church I worshiped in, and it was already a mega church, right? Mm-hmm. Seats 2,000 people. Wow. The church I worshiped in is a Buddhist meditation hall and Chinese school.
Wow.
That's a big change.
That's
the
great.
Tzu Foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, at least it's being used. Another rapid social change. The old First Baptist Church moved out on the highway too. What's now a Black Baptist church. I can tell you when I was growing up, blacks didn't go in that church. Like, I'm not saying they weren't welcome. They just weren't there.
Yeah.
Society has changed rapidly. Ideas of gender, same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights. These are things we hadn't even heard of. I didn't know what gay meant when I was 17 years old in Richardson. We've seen really rapid social change. And it's extremely unnerving and unsettling for people. an elderly gentleman who's passed away, would have been the age of my parents, once told me, we were talking about other things, and he was dying. But he said, and he was just being very honest, he said, I didn't want to live in a world in which a woman would go into combat. He himself had served in the military. Mm-hmm. The reason he said it was because his granddaughter was in combat. It wasn't a world he wanted to grow up into. He didn't want to see that change.
Right.
Now, he happened to be extremely flexible and say, it's the world it is.
Right.
But a lot of people use dogma to close that gap. Say,
right.
I don't want to live in that world. I don't want to live in that world. And so I'm going to build a barrier, and I'm going to live inside it, and I'm not going to look outside it.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Surround myself with like-minded people.
I'm going to surround myself with people just like me who believe the same things I am. And if I meet someone who has a different view, I will push them or hurt them or do something to make them remove themselves from my presence so I'm not disturbed.
Yeah, and again, I feel the social media aspect exacerbates this. It creates this echo chamber of surround. I mean, with the debate yesterday, I could only watch like 10 minutes of the debate yesterday, but I
watched 0 minutes. I went out to White Rock Lake and looked at the sunset. Yeah,
exactly. And watching and then being on Facebook for like 5 minutes, I'm like, what am I doing here? There was so much it's like team red versus team blue, and it's crazy. And so if, from a political standpoint in those cases, I'm going to, or what I did and what I'm doing is just getting as much information online from the websites, from the policies they say they're going to do, and trying to stay as far away from this echo chamber of, spewing, one message or another. It's just everywhere.
Well, it's to me, this is an interesting transformation that relates a little bit to, more than a little bit, to the question of religion and civil religion. A group of evangelicals have recently come out with a statement in which they are trying to basically separate evangelical Christianity from the political manifestations of Christian nationalism and this sort of thing. To basically say, in order to preserve what we think is important about our Christian belief, we have to get out of the toxic environment of politics. Right? They're not saying Christians shouldn't be socially active and engaged or vote. They're just saying this is toxic.
Right.
It's toxic for our faith. It's toxic for our religion. We've got to get out of it. In the same way that you sensed, and I think I sensed, that the hour and a half of the debate was not going to be good for my soul.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
How we can reconstruct our religious communities and our communities in general so that they don't get caught up in the toxicity of these divisions, I think is going to be a big deal. I think part of the problem is that we've, and I said I'm a person who's not inclined to have a guru, but we have turned our presidents into charismatic leaders rather than what I would hope they are, which is policy-oriented bureaucrats.
Right. Servants,
yeah. Right? Weber did a big study on different types of leadership. And I don't think it's healthy for society when our relationship with our elected leaders is one of fawning admiration of any sort, and it doesn't matter who that is. Mm-hmm. So to balance things out a little bit, I don't think fawning admiration for Barack Obama is any better than fawning admiration for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. These people should be elected to implement the policies that we think are the policies that should run our country. The more faceless they are, quite frankly, the better. But we've come to a place where we no longer see our presidents that way. They're huge figureheads. We want to bow down to them, do what they say. I'm not sure that's a healthy thing. It's not healthy. I know it's not healthy in religious bodies.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay. I'm pretty sure it's not healthy in political bodies as well.
Right.
Anecdote, if you've got time, I forget what our timing is, but
we're good. Yeah.
Okay. a few years ago in Austria, due to some scandals, Austria's got a parliamentary style of government. So they have a president who's kind of a figurehead, and then they have a prime minister who runs things. Complex politics scandal led to the government, meaning the prime minister and his party coalition, stepping down and saying, until our next election, they have regular elections, by the way. They don't have an election when the parliament can't get a majority. Basically saying, until our next election, the president will assign a bureaucratic head of government. And my party doesn't want to be. We've proven ourselves so horrible, scandal-ridden, that we're going to just step down. There's nobody else to step up until the next election. And so bureaucrats are going to run the show for 2 years. Now, of course, he made that move because he wanted to give 2 years to rebuild and come back into power.
Right. And
he knew that the best way was to shed it for a while.
Right.
That said, we visited 3 times during this period. My son-in-law, who is a business person, okay, I was asking him, how's this going? My daughter has strong political opinions, but I was interested in an Austrian. And he goes, it's like paradise. It's like paradise. Get rid of the politicians. They do so little anyway.
Right.
And the bureaucrats in Austria have run the show for 400 years, right? Make the trains run, the utilities work, taxes get collected, public services are provided, all of this.
Just enforce the laws, essentially.
Yeah,
right?
enforce the laws we have. We can do a couple of years without making new ones.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the United States is not Austria. But I think the sentiment he reflected was that we are well served by a functioning bureaucracy that's ruled by law. It is rule of law. Okay, we're not so well served by a continual charismatic whiplash where we're all looking towards this one person, and whether they sneeze or not tomorrow determines what our policy is.
Right. Well, I think a lot of people have. It's been flip-flopped. A lot of people should be focusing on the bureaucratics and the ones who are enacting and making things happen versus just the figureheads for those.
Exactly.
So I'm with you on that.
Yeah. Anyway,
yeah.
But that's true in the church as well. We're in rough times for religion. The churches that survive the best will largely be the ones in which the same group of faithful members that mow the grass and put the money in the thing and maintain the building keep doing what they do, let pastors come and go. I think we United Methodists or Methodists in general got this right. Shift your pastors around every 3 or 4 years.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Yeah.
Right. That's great.
Yeah. Let the body, let the congregation be built of the community of people who are always there.
Let that be the force.
Let that be the force,
yeah.
So that every transition of leadership isn't a major crisis.
Right.
I think we got it right. Other groups don't agree, so that's fine.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming here today.
Well, you're welcome.
I really appreciate it. This has been great.
I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
I really do, Pierre. And good luck on your Stoic journey.
I appreciate it. Yeah, we'll see where it takes you.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
That's great.